Welcome to the deep dive. We're all about exploring fascinating topics, and today we're diving into something pretty special, I think. I mean, it's you we're talking about, right? The way our minds work. We're taking a deep dive into this book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And, this isn't going to be your typical book review. We're going deeper. We're going to be pulling out the most useful and the most relevant insights, the stuff that you can actually use in your life.
And there's a lot to unpack, so much that's relevant to, well, like you said, pretty much everything we do.
Oh, absolutely. So we're going to be talking about why those first impressions can be so powerful, or how emotions can sometimes, lead us to make decisions we might regret. And, why planning for the future? Well, let's just say it can be a bit tricky.
It really all comes down to understanding those processes, how our minds actually work. And that's where Kahneman's work is so insightful. His core idea is that we've got two systems operating inside us all the time. He calls them System 1 and System 2.
Okay, two systems. Now, I'm intrigued. Can you break that down for me a little bit?
Sure. So System 1, you can think of it as your automatic pilot. Fast, intuitive, effortless. It's what helps you recognize faces, or know that 2 + 2 = 4. Or navigate familiar situations without even really thinking about it.
Okay, so it's kind of like our instinctual brain, the one that just reacts.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have System 2, that's like your slower, more deliberate side, more analytical. It kicks in when you're tackling a tough problem or making the big decision, or, for me at least, trying to remember where I left my keys.
Ah, yes, the key finding problem, a classic System 2 challenge. So it sounds like System 1 is that quick, instinctive reactor, and System 2 is more thoughtful, the measured one.
Precisely. And it's really fascinating? Kahneman discovered that we can actually, observe these systems in action. You can see how they're working. He did all this research using pupil dilation.
Wait, pupil dilation? How big our pupils get? What does that have to do with thinking?
Well, it turns out that it's a pretty good window into mental effort. So when people were given challenging mental tasks, complex calculations or something, their pupils noticeably dilated. But here's the really cool part. When someone hit their limit, cognitively, they just couldn't hold any more information, their pupils would either stop dilating or they'd actually shrink.
Wow. So it's like our pupils are a gauge for how much mental energy we're using? That's pretty amazing. But okay, how does all this connect to our everyday lives, to the choices we make?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. System 1, our fast and efficient friend, right? It relies on these mental shortcuts. They're called heuristics.
Heuristics, okay.
And usually they're actually quite helpful. They keep things running smoothly. But they can also lead to predictable errors in thinking. We call those cognitive biases.
Oh, those pesky cognitive biases. Yeah, I've definitely fallen victim to a few of those in my time.
Oh, we all have. Because System 1 is always on, constantly making these snap judgments, it sometimes leads us astray, even when System 2 is trying to, keep us on track.
So it's kind of like a tug of war going on in our minds all the time, between our intuition and our logic?
Exactly. And that brings us to one of Kahneman's most important ideas, what he calls WYSIAD. What you see is all there is.
Okay, WYSIAD. I like it already. What's that all about?
Well, it means that our System 1 loves to create a coherent story, even if we only have limited information. So it jumps to conclusions, based on what's right in front of us without necessarily considering all the facts.
So we're kind of filling in the blanks even when we don't have the whole picture.
Exactly. And this can really have an impact on, pretty much everything. Think about how you might judge someone's competence just based on their confidence, right? Even if you haven't actually seen them, do anything. Or how easily we can be swayed by a really compelling argument, especially if it supports what we already believe.
Yeah, that makes sense. We like those neat narratives, even if they might not be completely accurate. Is there an example maybe from the book that illustrates this idea of WYSIAD?
Oh, there are tons, but one of those famous ones is what he calls the Linda problem.
Yeah.
Okay, imagine I describe this woman named Linda. She's 31, single, outspoken, very bright, majored in philosophy. As a student, she was super passionate about issues of discrimination and social justice, participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to go with your gut here, okay? Which is more probable? A, Linda is a bank teller, or B, Linda's a bank teller and active in the feminist movement.
Okay. Let me think. My gut is telling me option B is more likely. It just seems to fit the description better, doesn't it?
Right, that's what most people think. Right. But here's the catch. From a purely logical perspective, option A actually has to be more probable. Think about it. The probability of two things happening together, Linda being a bank teller, A and D active in the feminist movement, can never be higher than the probability of just one of those things happening.
Oh, I see what you mean. By adding that detail about the feminist movement, we're actually making it less likely, even though it feels like it should be more likely.
Wow, that's so interesting. So we're falling prey to
The conjunction fallacy. We get tricked because a more detailed description well, it creates a story that seems more believable,
Yeah.
right? More vivid, even if it's statistically less likely.
So our brains are craving those compelling narratives, even if they sometimes lead us astray. So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
It's not about silencing our intuition altogether. It's important, but it's about being aware of its limits. When we're making decisions, we need to pause and engage system 2, that more deliberate part of us. We need to ask ourselves, am I jumping to conclusions? Am I letting that desire for a neat story, is it overriding the actual probabilities?
Yeah, it's almost like we need to be skeptical of our own intuitions, like double-check those quick judgments.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got WYSIETI. Now, I'm also really curious about this idea of priming. Is that related to WYSIETI? I mean, it sounds like it might be. Oh, definitely. They both highlight the power of, unconscious influences on how we think and act, right? Yeah. Priming, it's the idea that exposure to a word, a concept, even a physical sensation, can subtly influence our thoughts and behaviors afterward, even if we're not aware of it.
Okay. So things we encounter can kind of prime our minds to think or act in certain ways. That's a little unsettling, actually. Can you give an example?
Of course. There's this famous experiment, the invisible gorilla study. You'll be amazed by this.
Yeah.
Okay, so participants watched a short video of people passing a basketball back and forth, and they were asked to count the number of passes made by the players wearing white shirts.
Simple enough, right?
Yeah, sounds pretty straightforward. What's the twist?
Well, while they were busy counting those passes, someone in a gorilla suit walks right into the middle of the scene, thumps their chest, and walks off. And you won't believe this, about half the people missed the gorilla entirely.
No way! They didn't see a gorilla right in front of them. How is that even possible? Their attention was so focused on counting that they became, blind to something unexpected. It's called inattentional blindness.
That's incredible. So we can literally be blind to things if we're not actively looking for them. It makes you wonder what else we're missing all the time, right?
Exactly. And this priming thing, it's everywhere. It's how marketing works, how stereotypes affect us, even how our mood can influence our perception. Think about it. If you're in a bad mood, you're much more likely to interpret, someone's neutral expression as being negative, even if that wasn't their intention.
So our brains are constantly being primed by all these subtle cues, and we're usually completely clueless about it. That's both fascinating and a little bit creepy, don't you think?
Definitely. And it really underscores the need for awareness.
Yeah.
We need to be more mindful of the potential for all these unconscious influences, the way they're shaping our perceptions and our decisions.
Okay, I'm starting to see how understanding all these cognitive biases can be so valuable, how we can apply this to our lives. So we've got WYSIOT, criming. What else do you think our listeners should really know about?
One that's really important and has a big impact on a lot of things is loss aversion. It's this idea that the pain of a loss, you feel that much more strongly than the pleasure of an equal gain.
Loss aversion. Yeah, that definitely rings true. I mean, we've all felt that, right? That feeling of dread when we lose something, even if it's something small.
Right. And it can lead us to make decisions that, they might not actually be in our best interest.
So how does this loss aversion thing, how does it play out, in real life?
Think about negotiating a salary or selling something you own. Loss aversion suggests that, you'll probably be more effective if you can frame it in terms of what the other person stands to lose rather than what they might gain.
Okay, interesting. So by highlighting those potential losses, we make our offer seem more appealing. Are there any experiments that show this, that bring this idea to life?
Oh yeah, tons. One that's really interesting. It involved coffee mugs. So they divided participants into sellers and buyers. The sellers, they got a mug. They were told they could sell it. And the buyers, they had the chance to buy one.
Okay, I can picture it. Holding a nice warm mug. What happened next?
Well, they found that the sellers, they consistently asked for a much higher price for their mug than the buyers were willing to pay.
Oh, that's interesting. So just having something, owning it, makes us value it more, even if we didn't really care about it before. Wow. That's something to think about. I can see how that applies to so many things, like negotiating prices or, even holding on to investments.
It definitely explains why it's so hard to sell a stock that's, losing money, even if logically it's probably the right thing to do.
We get attached to what we have even if it's not serving us. Okay, so loss aversion, it's about that pain of losing what we have. Is that connected to how choices are presented to us? Like, can that affect our decisions?
Definitely. That's another really important concept. It's called the framing effect. And it shows how, just the way information is presented, even if the underlying facts are the same, it can drastically change what we choose.
Okay, how does framing actually work? Give me an example.
Imagine a scenario, okay? There's an outbreak, a deadly disease, and it's expected to kill 600 people. Now you've got two options to try to intervene. Program A, 200 people will be saved. Or Program B, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. So which program would you choose?
Oh, okay, that's a tough one. I think I'd probably go with Program A, the certainty of saving at least 200 lives. It feels safer, less risky than maybe saving no one.
Okay, now let's reframe it. Same outbreak, same potential loss of life. But here are your options now. Program C, 400 people will die. Or Program D, there's a 1/3 probability that no one will die and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. What do you choose now?
Whoa, okay. This framing, it definitely changes how I'm thinking. In this case, I'm actually leaning towards Program D. I'd rather take the chance, even though it's riskier, of maybe saving everyone.
That's exactly the framing effect. Both scenarios, they present the same statistical outcomes,
Right.
but just changing the wording, right? From saving lives to losing lives. It completely shifts how we think about risk. When it's framed as gains, we're usually risk averse. We want that sure thing. But when it's framed as losses, we get all risk seeking.
It's crazy how just subtle changes in the words can have such a huge impact. It makes you realize that we really need to pay attention to how information is being presented to us.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Knowing about this, it can help you see manipulative framing, in ads, in the news,
Yeah.
even in personal arguments. Always ask yourself, is this information, is it being presented in a way that might be swaying my decision? Am I seeing the whole picture?
That's a great point. So, okay, we need to be wary of those mental shortcuts, watch out for framing effects. Any other tips for navigating this whole complex world of decision making?
Well, a common trap is the planning fallacy. It's our tendency to underestimate how long things will take, or how much something will cost, or how much effort will be needed. And this happens even when we have past experience that should, help us.
The planning fallacy. Oh, I am so guilty of this one. Why do we keep falling into that trap over and over?
It's a mix of things. Overconfidence in our own abilities, definitely. And we tend to focus on the best case scenario, like downplaying all those potential obstacles. And you know what? Even experts fall prey to this. Kahneman actually shares a story in the book about how he totally underestimated how long it would take him to write a textbook.
Wait, even Kahneman, who literally wrote the book on cognitive biases, he fell for the planning fallacy. That's actually kind of comforting. It means we're all human.
Exactly. The key is to be aware of it, to recognize it when it's happening, and then we can develop strategies to mitigate it.
Okay, so how can we avoid falling into that trap? Any practical tips for our listeners?
One technique that can help is reference class forecasting. So instead of just relying on our own predictions, we can look at similar projects that have been completed in the past and use their outcomes as a baseline. It's about taking an outside view to counter that natural optimism we all have.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, learning from the experience of others, so we don't have to keep repeating the same mistakes.
Right. And another really important thing is to break those large projects down into smaller, more manageable tasks. That makes the whole project seem less overwhelming, but it also allows you to, estimate the time and effort more accurately for each step.
Break things down, consult those past examples, and remember that even the experts mess up sometimes. I feel like I'm getting a whole new toolkit for making better decisions thanks to this conversation.
That's great. Now, I want to talk about one of the most profound insights from the book. It's the distinction between the experiencing self and the remembering self.
Oh, yeah, the two selves. I remember you mentioning that earlier. Remind me what that's all about again.
Okay, so it's this concept that we have these two selves operating within us, right? The experiencing self, that's the one that lives in the moment. And then you have the remembering self, the one that shapes how we remember things, how we judge our past experiences.
So one is about how we feel during something, and the other is about how we remember and interpret it afterward.
Exactly. And they don't always agree. That remembering self, it often has way more influence on our decisions than the experiencing self, even though it's the experiencing self that actually lives through the events.
That's trippy. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about like vacations. Do you focus on enjoying each moment as it happens, like indulging every whim? Or are you meticulously planning everything, going for those Instagram-worthy shots, trying to create those memories that will impress your future self?
I definitely lean towards the memory-making side of things. I love exploring new places, even if it means being a little uncomfortable sometimes.
And that makes perfect sense from the remembering self's perspective. You're investing in those experiences, the ones that'll enrich your life story, even if they don't necessarily maximize every single moment of pleasure.
I get that. But I can also see how it can be a trap. What if we get so caught up in creating that perfect memory that we forget to actually enjoy what's happening right now?
Exactly. That's what Kahneman calls the tyranny of the remembering self.
Yeah.
We can end up making choices based on how we think we'll remember them rather than how they actually feel in the moment.
It's like we're living for the highlight reel and missing out on the whole movie.
It's about finding that balance, savoring the present moment, but also creating those memories that will bring us joy later on.
Yeah.
Kahneman poses this really interesting thought experiment. Imagine going on this incredible trip, amazing experiences, but afterward you lose all memory of it.
Mm-hmm.
Would you still consider it a good vacation?
Whoa. Okay, yeah. That's a tough one. I guess it shows how much we value those memories we create. But it also makes you wonder if sometimes we overemphasize how we'll remember something rather than just being fully present in the experience.
Exactly. What's more important, those fleeting feelings in the moment, or the story we tell ourselves later.
Maybe it doesn't have to be one or the other. Maybe there's a way to honor both.
Maybe so. And this whole idea of how we remember experiences, it's tied to Kahneman's research on happiness and life satisfaction. Because it turns out our memories, they don't always reflect how we actually felt during those events.
Really? So our memories are kind of unreliable narrator.
They can be. They can be influenced by our current mood, our expectations, even how we tell the story to ourselves or to other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. If I'm feeling down, I'm more likely to remember things in a negative light, right? Even if they weren't actually that bad. Is there a specific bias that explains this memory distortion thing?
Yeah, one key factor is what's called the peak end rule. Remember that cold hand experiment? Participants actually preferred the experience that was longer and colder, just because it ended on a slightly less painful note.
Oh, yeah. Even though the total discomfort was the same, the ending had this disproportionate impact on how they remembered it.
Exactly. And it applies to all kinds of experiences. Our memories, they're heavily shaped by the most intense moment and the ending, even if those moments don't represent the overall experience.
So a great ending can make a mediocre experience seem better in retrospect, and a bad ending can totally ruin the memory of an otherwise good experience.
You got it. Which means that our judgments about how happy or unhappy we were during something, they can be influenced by stuff that really has nothing to do with the actual amount of pleasure or pain we experienced.
Wow, that's a big one. It makes you realize how powerful our memories really are, how much they shape our perception of our own lives. So is there a way to use this knowledge to our advantage?
Well, absolutely. Knowing about this peak end rule, it can help us design experiences that are more likely to be remembered positively. For example, let's say you're planning a party, right? Or a vacation. Pay extra attention to the ending. Make it memorable, even if everything hasn't been, absolutely perfect throughout.
That's a good strategy. It's like crafting the grand finale so the whole thing is remembered more fondly. But I'm also curious about the bigger picture for life satisfaction.
Yeah.
If our memories are so influential, how does that affect how we judge our lives overall?
Well, Kahneman found that people often judge their lives based on a few key moments, rather than considering the whole experience. He did a study where he asked people to evaluate the life of this fictional character, Jen. She lived a happy and fulfilling life, but then, towards the end, there was a brief period where she was a bit less happy. And guess what? People rated Jen's life as less desirable overall just because it didn't end on as high a note.
That's amazing. So even a brief dip in happiness near the end can overshadow years of contentment.
It shows how powerful those final moments can be. Sobering, but it's also empowering.
Empowering. How so?
Because it means we have some control over how our stories end, right? By focusing on creating positive experiences and memories towards the end, we can potentially shape how we and others remember our whole journey.
That's a beautiful way to look at it. It's not just about a happy ending, it's about a meaningful one. It's like we should focus on what we can control rather than dwelling on the stuff we can't.
Exactly. And, Kahneman's work also sheds light on this complex relationship between money and happiness. It turns out how much we earn, it affects our day-to-day well-being and our life satisfaction in different ways.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear more about this. We all know that saying money can't buy happiness, but is there any truth to that?
It's complicated. Kahneman found that up to a certain point, having more money, it does make us happier. We can buy things we enjoy, we have more security, more freedom, but after we hit a certain income level, usually enough to cover our basic needs and feel comfortable, the relationship between money and happiness, it kind of plateaus.
So there's like a point of diminishing returns.
Exactly. More money doesn't necessarily lead to more day-to-day happiness. However, higher income does tend to increase life satisfaction.
That's so interesting. So we might not be feeling happier day to day, but we're more likely to judge our lives as better, more successful when we're well off.
That seems to be the case. And this is where the remembering self comes in again. When we evaluate our lives, we're creating a story, right?
Right.
About our successes and failures and financial success. It often plays a big role in that story.
It's like money becomes a symbol of achievement, even if it doesn't always translate into more happiness in those everyday moments.
It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? We strive for money, thinking it'll bring happiness. But then we get to a point where more money doesn't actually make us feel any happier, even though we might believe our lives are better.
It really makes you think about where we find meaning, beyond those material things.
Right. It's about cultivating those other sources of fulfillment, like relationships, activities that we find engaging, a sense of contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's not about rejecting financial security, but understanding its limitations when it comes to true happiness.
Exactly. And speaking of limitations, there's another bias Kahneman talks about that's really important, the focusing illusion. It explains how we tend to overestimate the importance of, whatever we're currently focused on. It could be our income, our relationships, even the weather.
The focusing illusion. Okay, tell me more. I have a feeling this one might apply to me.
It's like shining a spotlight, right, on just one aspect of our lives. And it makes that thing seem super important, even if it's not really that crucial in the grand scheme of things.
Is there a study that illustrates this?
Oh, yeah. This classic one looked at happiness and climate. They asked students in California and the Midwest to rate their overall life satisfaction. And guess what? No significant difference between the two groups, even though Californians were way happier with their climate.
Wait, really? Even though those Midwestern students had to deal with long, cold winters, they weren't any less satisfied with their lives overall.
Nope. And they attributed it to the focusing illusion. When asked about their lives in general, the Midwest students weren't really thinking about the weather all the time, so it didn't have a big impact on their overall judgment. But when they were asked specifically about the climate, they rated it as more important. And then that led them to rate their lives as less satisfying.
That's so interesting. So just by bringing something to our attention, it can make it seem way more important than it actually is.
Exactly. And the focusing illusion, it can really distort our perceptions and our choices. For example, if you're obsessing over getting a new car, you might overestimate how much happier that new car will actually make you.
It's like we're always chasing after that next thing, that next experience that we think will be the key to happiness. But we miss all those little joys that are already there, all around us.
It's the classic hedonic treadmill, right? We just keep running, chasing, never really arrive.
Okay, so how do we step off that treadmill? How do we avoid this focusing illusion trap?
Awareness is key. We need to actively broaden our perspective. Don't get too fixated on the moment, on whatever's grabbing your attention right now. Remember, there's a whole lot more to life than just that one thing.
It's about being grateful for what we have instead of always focusing on what we lack.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that happiness isn't a destination. It's the journey. Finding joy in those small moments, appreciating the simple things, cultivating a sense of meaning and purpose.
Love that. Okay, so we've talked about all these fascinating biases, how they influence our choices, how we view happiness. It's starting to feel like a big puzzle with all these interconnected pieces. How do we put it all together? How do we actually use these insights to live better?
That's where it gets really exciting. Kahneman's work provides a framework, not just for understanding how our minds work, but how to make better decisions in this complex and uncertain world.
Okay, I'm all in. What kind of framework are we talking about?
He challenges those traditional economic models, the ones that assume we're perfectly rational and always act in our own best interest. He shows us that our emotions, our biases, even our two selves, they all play a role in how we make decisions.
So it's not about, like, becoming perfectly rational, which, let's face it, is probably impossible, but about becoming more self-aware and developing those strategies to, overcome our limitations.
Exactly. And one of the most practical ways to apply this framework is in the realm of risk and uncertainty. In a world that's constantly changing, we need to be able to make decisions, even when we don't know what the outcome will be.
That's for sure. It feels like that's more and more important these days. So how does Kahneman approach this whole idea of risk and uncertainty?
He introduces this concept of risk policies. So instead of trying to make the perfect decision in every single situation, which is, probably impossible, we should develop general policies for how we approach those risky situations.
So it's like having a set of guidelines to help us through those tough choices.
Exactly. It's about creating a framework that aligns with our values, our goals, even when the future is totally unclear.
I like that. Taking control of the process rather than feeling like we're at the mercy of our emotions.
Right. And one of the most important risk policies Kahneman suggests is to be, loss averse when it comes to big decisions. What that means is we should be more willing to accept small losses than to chase after those big gains, because the pain of a loss is usually greater than the pleasure of an equal gain.
That's interesting. It kind of goes against, like, the whole idea of go big or go home, doesn't it? Our culture seems to celebrate that whole risk-taking thing.
It is a more cautious approach, definitely, but it can be a very smart strategy,
Yeah.
especially when the stakes are high. It's like that saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Spread the risk.
Yeah, by being careful about those big gambles, we can protect ourselves from, potentially huge losses.
So it's not about never taking risks. It's about being strategic, thoughtful.
Exactly. And this risk policy thing, it applies to lots of areas. Investing, starting a business, even choosing a romantic partner.
Wow. Okay. It's about finding that sweet spot, being bold, but also being prudent, taking risks, but also protecting ourselves.
Exactly. It's interesting to think about this risk policy in the context of public policy. The decisions governments make, they often involve huge risks, not just for individuals, but for whole societies.
So you're saying policymakers, they should also be more loss averse, more cautious about those big risks, even if there's a chance for a big payoff.
That's Kahneman's argument. Because if a major policy fails, the consequences, they can be disastrous. It's crucial to consider those potential losses just as carefully as you consider the potential gains.
That makes a lot of sense. Not all risks are worth taking. Sometimes the best course of action is to play it safe. So we've talked about these risk policies, how being loss averse can be a good strategy. Anything else that can help us make better decisions when we don't know what the future holds?
One thing Kahneman emphasizes is the limitations of expertise. We tend to put a lot of faith in experts, right? But his research shows that they're just as susceptible to cognitive biases as anyone else, especially something called the illusion of validity, where we believe we're right even when the evidence says otherwise.
So don't just blindly trust the experts.
Right. It's not about dismissing expertise altogether.
Okay.
But we need to be discerning. Look at their track record, at the data. Don't just be swayed by, their confidence or their titles.
Be critical, ask for evidence, and don't be fooled by fancy credentials.
Exactly. And another interesting thing is Kahneman found that algorithms can actually be really effective at making decisions, especially when it involves complex information or high stakes.
Algorithms. Really? I usually associate that with, computers, not with how people make decisions.
It might seem weird, but it turns out algorithms can be more accurate, more objective than even expert human judgment.
Wow. So are there examples of that out there in the real world?
There are tons. Like in medicine, studies have found that using simple algorithms based on a few key factors can be more accurate at diagnosing some diseases than even doctors with lots of experience.
That's amazing. So sometimes a simple formula can outperform even years of training and intuition.
It's true. Algorithms can be really powerful tools for decision-making, especially when things are complex or we're feeling a lot of emotions.
So it's not about replacing humans. It's about using algorithms to, boost our thinking, to help us overcome those biases.
That's it. Combining the best of both worlds. One of the most practical takeaways from Kahneman's work is his emphasis on developing what he calls our inner critic. It's like an internal watchdog that helps us see our biases so we can make better choices.
An inner critic. That sounds useful.
It's like having a wise friend, always there to challenge you, keep you grounded.
So how do we get one of those? Can we just like download an app for that?
Huh. Well, it's a skill. You develop it with practice. And one of the most important ways is to cultivate a sense of humility.
Humility, how does that help with making decisions?
Humility means admitting that we don't know everything and that we make mistakes and that, it's good to get different perspectives, to be willing to be wrong.
Being okay with being wrong, that's tough.
It is, but it's so worth it. When we approach decisions with humility, we're more likely to look at all sides of an issue, get more information, and, be willing to change our minds.
So humility is the key to more rational thinking.
It's a big part of it. And Kahneman stresses that just being aware of our biases isn't enough. We have to question them, challenge them, work to overcome them. It takes effort.
It's like this constant battle, isn't it, between those biases and our desire to make good choices.
It is. It's this ongoing process, self-reflection, self-improvement. But the rewards are huge. When we're more aware of our thinking, we can make better decisions, live better lives, and even help create a more just and equitable world.
That's inspiring. So we've covered so much today. We talked about the two systems of thinking, those cognitive biases, how to make better decisions when things are uncertain.
And how important it is to develop that inner critic and to be humble in our pursuit of a good life.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation, but we're not quite done yet. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some even deeper and even more practical implications of Kahneman's work. It's about, understanding ourselves, making decisions, and really designing the kind of lives we want to live.
So stick with us as we continue exploring thinking fast and slow.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into thinking fast and slow. We've been exploring all these fascinating insights into how our minds work.
And now it's all about applying those insights to, to actually live better lives.
Exactly. I mean, it's great to understand how our minds work, but ultimately it's about using that knowledge, right, to make better choices, to create a better world.
That's where it gets really interesting. One of the most important areas where Kahneman's work has a huge impact is in thinking about happiness and well-being. He really challenges, those traditional ideas of happiness being just about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain.
Okay, so it's not just about seeking out those good times and avoiding the bad ones. There's more to it.
Oh, much more. Remember those two selves we were talking about? The experiencing self and the remembering self. Well, they don't always agree on what a good life actually looks like.
Right. The experiencing self might be all about, indulging in those immediate pleasures, whereas the remembering self is focused on creating a good story, even if it means, making some sacrifices along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And one of Kahneman's key findings is that we're actually not very good at predicting what will really make us happy.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to, overestimate the impact of both positive and negative events.
So we think landing that dream job will bring us, eternal happiness, or that a breakup will ruin our lives forever, but it's usually not that simple, right?
Right. He calls it the impact bias, that tendency to exaggerate the intensity and the duration of our emotional reactions.
It's like we're looking at the future with these, emotionally tinted glasses. Everything seems more extreme than it really is. So how do we overcome that? How do we make choices that are actually aligned with our long-term happiness?
One thing that can help is paying attention to other people's experiences. People who've been through similar situations. Kahneman calls them surrogation experiences.
So talk to people who've achieved that goal you're after or experienced the setback you're worried about.
Yeah, get a reality check from someone who's been there. You'll often find that the emotional impact, it wasn't as intense or as long-lasting as you might have imagined.
It's like tapping into their wisdom, right, to get a better sense of what to expect.
Exactly. And another important strategy is, focusing on what we can control rather than, dwelling on the things we can't.
Yeah, that makes sense. Our happiness is often more about our mindset, our choices, than about our circumstances.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
By shifting our focus from what we can't control to what we can control, we're taking charge. We're creating a life that feels more meaningful.
We're not just letting those external forces dictate our happiness.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really important part of Kahneman's work, understanding risk and uncertainty in a deeper way.
Okay, risk and uncertainty. Yeah, that feels especially relevant today, right? Everything's changing so fast.
You're absolutely right. We're constantly bombarded with information, and we're faced with all these complex choices. Kahneman challenges those traditional models that assume we're always, totally rational and always trying to avoid risk.
So we're not always those, cool, calculating decision makers like they show in the movies.
Not always. Our emotions, our biases, even our two selves, remember, they all influence how we see and respond to risk.
Okay, so how do we navigate that? How do we make good decisions when the future is so uncertain?
One of Kahneman's biggest contributions is this thing called prospect theory. It's basically a way to explain how we make decisions when there's risk involved. It's a lot more psychologically realistic than those old economic theories.
So it actually takes into account all those messy human emotions and biases, the stuff we've been talking about.
Exactly. It helps us see why we sometimes make choices that seem, totally irrational on the surface. We're driven by fear, hope, the desire to avoid regret, all that stuff.
Oh, yeah. This reminds me of that whole loss aversion thing. It's not always about, like, getting the biggest reward. Sometimes it's about avoiding those potential losses, even if it means, passing up a good opportunity.
Exactly. And prospect theory, it helps explain a lot of what happens in investing, for example. People often make decisions based on fear and greed rather than, clear assessment of the actual risk and reward.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. When the stock market is doing great, everyone wants to jump in. But then as soon as it dips a little, everyone panics.
It's those emotional responses, right? Driving those booms and busts.
Okay, so how do we avoid getting caught up in all that? How do we make smarter investment decisions, ones that aren't driven by panic?
The key is to have a plan, an investment plan, and to stick to it. No matter what the market is doing in the short term, you have to have long-term perspective.
So discipline, basically. Don't chase those quick returns and don't make impulsive decisions based on fear.
Exactly. And another really important strategy is diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, as they say. Spread your risk.
It's like building a portfolio that's strong, one that can handle those ups and downs that always happen.
Exactly. And these principles, they apply to so many other areas of life, not just investing. It's about being aware of our biases, setting those clear goals, and developing strategies that are aligned with what's truly important to us in the long run.
So whether it's money, career, relationships, those same principles can guide us towards better choices.
Absolutely. And one of the most, I think, encouraging things about Kahneman's work is his belief that even though we're all prone to these biases, we can learn. We can get better at making decisions. It's not about being perfectly rational. It's about being more aware of our thinking and developing strategies to overcome our limitations.
So we're not doomed. Even with all those biases, we can become better decision makers.
That's right. And remember that inner critic we talked about, that voice that questions things, that can be a huge help in this process.
Like having a built-in bias detector.
Exactly. The more we listen to that inner critic, the better we get at resisting those biases and making choices that really reflect our values and our goals.
So how do we strengthen that inner critic? Is there a mental workout we can do?
It's more about a mindset, really. Be open, be curious, surround yourself with people who will challenge you, who have different perspectives, who aren't afraid to tell you when you might be wrong.
So it's about creating that environment where we can safely question things and learn from our mistakes.
Absolutely. And Kahneman's work also has really important implications for, how we design institutions and systems.
So all these insights about human biases, we can use them to create better systems.
Exactly. If we acknowledge that we're all prone to these cognitive traps, right? Then we can design systems that help us, avoid those traps to create more fair outcomes.
Do you have any real-world examples of that?
Of course. Like healthcare. Kahneman's work has been super influential in developing decision-making tools and protocols that help doctors make more accurate diagnoses and choose the best treatments.
So by understanding how our minds work, we can actually design systems that help us make better choices, even in those really high-stakes situations.
That's right. And in the legal system, his research on framing and loss aversion has been used to make sentencing guidelines more fair, both for victims and defendants.
That's incredible. Understanding human psychology and using it to make the world more just.
It's a great example of how behavioral science can have a real impact. And, on a personal level, Kahneman's work is an invitation to, really get to know ourselves, to be more mindful of how we think, and to be more deliberate about the choices we make.
It's like we're being challenged to step off that autopilot and really engage, to become more conscious.
That's it, exactly. It's about taking charge of our lives, writing our own stories.
And in doing that, we can make better choices for ourselves and help create a better world for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's been great exploring his ideas with you.
Thanks for being our guide on this fascinating journey. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how my mind works and how I can use that knowledge to make better decisions.
The key takeaway, I think, is that understanding how our minds work, it's the key to making better decisions, living a more fulfilling life, creating a better world for ourselves and for future generations.
To all our listeners out there, keep those two systems in mind. Be aware of your biases and always, always be willing to challenge your own thinking.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep. And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.